say what you might about the Anglo-American sphere of influence, it's by no means self-evident that either China, Russia, or Iran stand out as shining moral lights to emulate as an alternative. I mean, China is a desperately terrible totalitarian communist state. Iran is basically an Islamo-fascist regime. And while Russia seems to be the outlier to some degree, but because at least nominally it could be allied with the West, but it's certainly proved extremely problematic in new ways since the end of the Cold War. So, I mean, on what grounds can countries like China and Iran, for example, offer anything even remotely like an alternative to the sphere of Anglo-American domination? Let's start with China.
Right. Well, China offers what China offers countries, or at least did offer, because its offering has gotten less attractive between the mounting totalitarianism, the economic trouble that they're in, and the reaction to COVID. They were saying, look, you don't have to buy the Western package in order to become rich and powerful. And furthermore, they were saying to somebody like the ruler of a country like Zimbabwe or other countries, we'll give you money, we'll give you tech. We won't ask you any questions about how much money your brother-in-law is making out of the deal. No pesky auditors. We will, we're not like the Anglo-Americans. We won't try to make you behave. We'll empower you to do exactly as you like. Now, that is not a positive agenda for an alternative world order, but it is an offer that a lot of governments or a lot of powerful individuals might find attractive.
Yeah, powerful and corrupt individuals. I mean, so let's take that apart a little bit. So the first part of that is the proposition that you can actually be wealthy, or let's say have abundant resources and a reasonable standard of living for your citizens, not for you, without adopting something like the underlying metaphysics of the Western moral code. Yep. And that proposition strikes me as highly improbable, given that the only reason that China's rich at all is because it managed to integrate itself with the West and essentially adopt quasi-capitalist principles without actually adopting the underlying metaphysic. And I don't think their system is stable. I don't think they're going to be able to propagate that well-being into the future. I mean, you said yourself that China has tilted very heavily under Xi towards an increasing totalitarianism, and that's pretty much self-evident. And the fact that they can only peddle their wares with regards to, what would you say, their profitability on the dictator front to corrupt governments also indicates the moral bankruptcy of their offerings. So if what China has to offer is the ability to bring together, the corrupt dictators of the world, that doesn't seem like a very plausible or sustainable alternative to Anglo-American domination.
Right.
So, and I mean, China seems to be facing a whole host of problems now, too, including demographic problems that are deadly serious.
Right. Well, Jordan, this Anglo-American order is 300 years old, and a lot of people have tried to shake it over the centuries. You can go back to Louis XIV in France, who said, I'm going to have this centralized, powerful, planned economy. We're going to have all the economic and military power of the British, but we're not going to have all that messy political liberalism. And it didn't work, but he put up a good fight that convulsed the world for many years. Napoleon really exactly the same, challenging that Anglo-American, still at that time, British world order, and saying, my dictatorship, my enlightened dictatorship, can create a powerful economy that the stupid British cannot match, and an army that they can't defeat. And he rampaged for quite a while. He did ultimately fall apart, and rightly so. I think Kaiser Wilhelm II, I think Hitler, Tojo, and Stalin, all in their different ways, had the same idea, that the sort of technocratic dictatorship, centralized power and planning could create an economy and a society that could challenge this Anglo-American hegemony. We're called the liberal world system. And they all failed, but they all thought, okay, I'll learn from the past, now I'll win. And I think China is thinking along those lines too.
Yeah, well, I think there's a fallacy at the bottom of that presumption. that basically is biological in nature. I mean, one of the things I've observed as a consequence of watching the United States as an outsider, let's say for 50 years, 50 conscious years, let's say, is that diversity of approach beats efficiency of monolithic view. And so what I always see happening in the United States is, well, you guys are crazy about 80% of the time and going off the rails in 5 different directions, but there's always someone in the United States doing something crazily innovative and sane, always. And so what seems to happen is that the US washes up against the shores of various forms of political idiocy, but there's so much diversity of approach in the US, especially given its massive population and its federated system and its genuine freedoms, that someone somewhere is doing the next right thing. And then America is, what would you call it, open-minded enough and adaptive enough so that if someone is doing the right thing, then they spawn imitators extremely rapidly. And Americans just capitalize on that like mad. And you get this situation where you could imagine, and I think the Japanese managed this for a while, you could imagine that if you just happened to stumble on the right vision, if you were an efficient and benevolent totalitarian, you could be more effective over like a 5-year period. But you're going to have a hell of a time with power transitions. That's a deadly problem. And then if the world shifts on you that's not in a way that isn't commensurate with your ideological vision, then you have no alternative approaches to rely on. And my observation has been that just scuttles all these countries that try to compete with this distributed and creative, free Anglo-American ethos. And I do think there's a biological reason for that, is that, one of the ways that biological systems compute adaptation is by producing a very large variety of mutations, right, of variant offspring. And most of those offspring perish. But the only solution to that problem of excess mortality, let's say, on the biological front, is the provision of multiple variants. And the Anglo-American system, because it's distributed and because it places a substantial amount of power in the hands of individuals and subsidiary organizations, its medium to long-term creativity simply can't be beat. And it is inefficient in that it's, a lot of the variants that the US produces, a lot of businesses and so forth fail. But those that succeed can succeed spectacularly, and that happens continually. And that seems like an unstoppable force. And, you just outlined 300 years of history showing that these monolithic centralists who believe that central planning and efficiency will defeat distributed creativity, they're just wrong one after the other. You'd think eventually we'd learn that was just wrong, and maybe we have to some degree.
Yeah, well, I think the circle is spreading of countries or cultures and individuals who do see this advantage. But as a student of history rather than biology or psychology, what I see is that we keep having these wars. And so, I can say, I actually do believe the Chinese system, the Russian system in its own way, the Iranian system certainly cannot really continue as they wish and will fail in the competition. I look at the devastation that we've seen, the Napoleonic Wars, the World Wars. And so our problem on our side is not simply to wait for the time when our diversity and our innovation will clearly triumph, but we have to try to manage or work in foreign policy and security policy to try to prevent new catastrophic wars on this scale, even though the chances are pretty good that we will prevail in the end.
As a spouse, a parent, or a leader, people count on you. But if you're constantly tired, unfocused, and just not feeling like yourself, how can you show up the way they need you to? That's where Merrick Health comes in. Merrick is a premier health optimization platform that uses comprehensive lab work, not guesswork, to uncover what's really going on in your body. Hormones, thyroid inflammation, nutrient levels, the markers that matter. Their expert clinical teams build a personalized, research-backed plan just for you, whether it's lifestyle changes, supplements, or prescription treatments. When you know what's going on inside, you can lead with clarity, show up with energy, and stay sharp for your family, your team, and yourself. Head over to MerrickHealth.com and use code Peterson for 10% off to join their guided optimization program with your personal medical team. That's MerrickHealth.com, code Peterson. Stop guessing, start leading, and start with Merrick Health.
Right. Well, it looks to me right now on the Chinese front, I mean, they're experiencing a level of domestic unrest that for China appears to be somewhat unprecedented. And it seems to me that it's perhaps clearly in the interest of the Chinese authorities to do something like saber rattle extremely hard over Taiwan to divert their populace's attention from their domestic failures. And so that strikes me as maybe I'm being pessimistic about it, although obviously lots of people are concerned about China and Taiwan. I mean, Xi seems to be attempting to consolidate power in the same manner as people like Mao. He's turned out to be a real totalitarian dictator rather than someone who's moving China, maybe like the Chinese leader who modernized. Was it Dao? What's his name?
Deng Xiaoping.
Deng Xiaoping. Yes, exactly. He doesn't seem like another Deng Xiaoping. He seems to me more like another Mao, and that's very worrisome on the Taiwan front. So what do you think's on the horizon on the China front, and what do you think the West should do about it?
Right. No, it's really interesting because from the Chinese point of view, first of all, we have to understand that the people like I and you would talk to from China aren't representative of the mass of the Chinese in China. The average Chinese person has never left China, didn't study for years in the English-speaking world at an American or Canadian university or what have you, and for them, it looks very frustrating. They see China as this great nation with a growing economy, largest population in the world, at least until India catches up. And then they look and look at Iran, a tiny country, backwards in many ways compared to China, which has been running the table in the Middle East. It's in Syria, it's in Lebanon, it's in Yemen, it's causing problems everywhere you look. Even Russia has gotten Crimea and has achieved things. Where has the Chinese government gotten? What has it done? The answer is it's done less than Iran, done less than than Russia in terms of expanding. So I think there's pressure on the Chinese government from a lot of Chinese public opinion. Why aren't you more effective? If we're as great as you're telling us, why don't the foreigners see that and give ground to us? So there's a clash between what a lot of Chinese people think China's place in the world should be and what they actually see. And the government, as you say, at this time of huge stress, their COVID policy, they locked them down for years, and now they're still having a massive epidemic. The housing market, which is where most Chinese have their savings and investment, house prices have been going down for almost 3 years. There's a major crisis building financially in China. And so the government is in a real pickle as to what does it do next. And that makes it a little bit unpredictable internationally.
Well, I was just curious as to your evaluation of the Biden administration's response to the situation in Taiwan. What opinions do you have about the Biden formulation of foreign policy in relationship to China?
Look, I think the Biden administration has done a reasonably good job so far in terms of its messaging on Taiwan and on the U.S.-China relations. The CHIP Act, and it's putting economic pressure. It is trying to stop the penetration. So much of Chinese growth has really come from the theft of IP and from intellectual property, from Chinese state subsidies to corporations, in key sectors that are able to use those subsidies to compete unfairly in the rest of the world. And I think we are beginning to see, and this, it started in the Trump years, and even President Obama talked about a pivot to Asia. So there's been a growing awareness in the U.S. on a need to focus more on China and not just sort of sit here and wait for capitalism to turn China democratic, which is what we were maybe doing 20 years ago. So we're definitely ahead on that front.
So since I was a young person, what's happened in China? Well, first of all, when I started to become politically aware, let's say back in the 1970s, I remember going to a trade fair in Edmonton, Alberta. It was one of the first trade fairs that the Chinese participated in. That probably is about 1974, something like that. And we went and looked at, the Chinese had a display there of their industrial products, and it looked like stuff that had been manufactured in the West right after the Second World War. Like it looked like stuff that was built in the 1950s. But that was the first time in my lifetime that we saw anything at all of China. And then, of course, when I was very young, the threat of famine was still something that we associated with China. And what I've seen happen in my lifetime is that China has become an economic powerhouse, that the threat of famine has receded substantially, that the Chinese had been integrated, at least to some degree, into the world economy, that the West had benefited, arguably, from an influx of unbelievably inexpensive consumer goods as Chinese manufacturing quality improved, as it did in Japan. And for a good while, it looked like the Chinese were going to settle in beside us in lockstep, even though as competitors and cooperators, and move us all towards a relatively integrated capitalist future. And of course, the presumption was that as that happened, that the state would liberalize, not least because there would be all sorts of individuals in China who now had a certain degree of economic power, and that the Chinese would incrementally transform into, essentially, into allies playing under the same system. And I think that really was happening in a pretty damn optimistic way for a number of decades, till Xi decided to centralize control and turn himself into another Mao. And it isn't obvious that the optimism that the West had in relationship to China was exactly misplaced. I mean, I think the Western working class paid a big price for integrating China. But other than that, the Chinese aren't starving anymore, which is certainly a big plus. And there were a lot of positives to attempting to integrate the Chinese into the world economy. The downside was we seemed to become more dependent on their largesse and goodwill than we needed to. And then, of course, China as a totalitarian model is a destabilizing force in the international order.
Well, you're absolutely right. And I would agree with you completely that, well, look, until a few years ago, I would travel pretty freely in China. And a couple of my books have been translated into Chinese, and I would speak at Chinese universities and talk with professors and officials. And the view that you just expressed was very common. This is what they felt China was doing and should do, was move toward this kind of integration to become what some Chinese used to tell me, a normal country is what they wanted China to become. And I think there are a lot of people there who still hope that. Obviously, they're not going to say so right now. That would not be good for you or your family if you started talking that way. But I think that what happened in some ways is we tended to forget that the Chinese Communist Party is a real thing and it wants to hold power. And there are lots of people who see, they look at Chinese history. Yes, the Communist Party has killed more Chinese than anything ever in the history of the world, have died as a result of Mao's famines and other things, far eclipsing the death toll, say, in their war against Japan even. But that said, as you pointed out, the economic growth of the last 30, 35 years in China is one of the great miracles of human history.
Yeah.
And you would have to have a heart of stone not to be glad that hundreds of millions of people have come out of poverty, that new ways of life are opening up, new access to culture, to education. It's what we should all be doing. It's progress and it's good.
Right.
But that very progress of the society, I think, terrified the Communist Party, because they could see themselves losing control. They could see, and there is in Chinese history and culture, it's a country of 1.4 billion people. That's like what, 4 times the population of the European Union. And it's not so easy to Chinese history is a story of the balance between central and local governments. They've had periods of division and war and weakness when others have taken advantage when the central government was weak. So instead of, in a way, relaxing and liberalizing more as their economic policies succeeded, many in the Chinese Communist Party became, really worried that things were going to get out of control. And for a number of years, even before we saw the international hostility, what we saw was gradually, in sector after sector, they were tightening up the control of this central communist elite, and more under one man, Xi Jinping. They were tightening using every lever they could to impose uniformity in China, to reassert, even in companies now, every company has to have a Communist Party cell in it. So we're back to the kind of Communist Party dominance.
Commissars.
Yes, exactly. And obviously, as a Western investor, that's a tough thing when you've got the Communist Party cell running your company. Do you really own the company, et cetera? So it's a
right.
So they're moving from a good period into a much more difficult one, I think.
Right. Well, I think also that people were optimistic, and rightly so, after 1989, because once the Soviets gave up the ghost, it looked for a pretty long period of time that you couldn't beat the communist drum very hard anymore, that the internal contradictions that were part and parcel of the ethos had made themselves manifest in a manner that was utterly unmistakable. And just as the Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of its own internal idiocy, so was the Chinese Communist Party doomed to eventual failure. And it's certainly, but I guess part of the problem is that even in the West, we don't seem to be of one mind when we look at the contradiction between Western productivity and generosity, let's say, and general well-being at the level of the citizen, and the contradictions between that and a radical leftist view of the world, right? I mean, our own society is rife with this culture war, predicated at least on the part that capitalism is inherently oppressive, and so is Western culture in general. And of course, the Chinese communists believe that in spades. And if we can't get our own house in order with regards to the pathology of these ideas in the West, in some sense, it's not that surprising that the Chinese remain dominated by them. But the long-term consequences of that can't be good. I mean, what I see happening, I think, in the West, in the US in particular, is that people are losing faith in China as a trading partner, and we're starting to pull back a tremendous amount of manufacturing capacity and decreasing investment and pulling away from China as a trading partner. And of course, that'll just make things more desperate in China, which is not a good thing.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing. In the West, we read 1989 and the events in the Soviet Union as a glorious victory. But in China, and Putin is on their wavelength here, they saw it very differently. What they saw is, look at the Soviet Union. Gorbachev tried to liberalize and to introduce some democratic elements into the Soviet Union. And look what happened. The Soviet Union fell apart. Russia was impoverished for a decade. It lost its great power status in the world. And the West, as they saw it in Russia and in China, just, sort of walked all over them and did whatever it wanted. And the Iranians saw this too. So the message for these leaders is, don't liberalize. Liberalism is a poison, and even a little bit of it can begin to corrode and destroy your society. And if you let it in, it will wreck your power and devastate everything. So they actually became, they did not say, oh, how enchanting Western democracy is. They said how dangerous it is. And we've heard Putin complain and talk about the color revolutions, different liberalizing revolutions in post-Soviet countries. And they see the West as leading this kind of subversion, and that Western ideas and Western freedoms are a fundamental threat to their own power, and given the uses some of them have made of that power, made of their personal survival.
Right, right. Well, though that seems like a reasonable concern for ideologically motivated totalitarian dictators.
Right.
It's definitely the case that Western liberal ideals will not provide an environment where their kind of psychopathic power playing is going to be successful.
Right.
So they have every reason to be intimidated by that.
Right. And I think our mistake was not to realize that, we were saying, hey, we're not, we're going to wait patiently for China to evolve. But on the side of the Chinese Communist Party, they were saying, well, we're not just going to wait patiently until liberalism comes in and wrecks us. We're going to preemptively do what we need to do to maintain our power. So I think
Right, well, maybe we should have known that because they never wavered in their support for North Korea.
That's right. And they were also very careful always to say, we want economic liberalization, not political liberalization.